Have you ever wondered who the giants in the Bible really were? If you think that these creatures are just ancient legends, get ready for an astonishing revelation. Recent research has unveiled the true height of the Nephilim, the biblical giants who have left behind a mystery through the centuries. And the most surprising part? The details revealed by both the Bible and modern discoveries could completely change your perspective on these mythical beings. It's time to question what many consider to be the truth. Why do so many ancient texts from different cultures speak about giant beings? And what if these figures were not merely metaphors, but actually walked the earth? In this detailed analysis, you will discover that the Nephilim were not just large. They represented a force that altered human history and spirituality. And don't think that we're only talking about ancient tales here. Archaeological evidence and biblical accounts reveal a truth that could affect your view of the world today. If you are curious to understand how these giants impacted humanity and what else can be revealed about their true height, then you are in the right place. This is your chance to dive deep into a fascinating investigation that connects the Bible, science, and mysteries that are waiting to be unraveled. Before you begin, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our intriguing biblical studies. The story of the Nephilim begins surprisingly in the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis. There, we find a mysterious passage that speaks of the sons of God who united with the daughters of men. From this union, the Nephilim were born, mighty and gigantic beings. But who were these sons of God? Many scholars believe that this phrase describes fallen angels, heavenly beings who disobeyed God and came to earth. Imagine how astonished people were when they first heard these stories. These were not ordinary men, but supernatural beings who mingled with humans and gave rise to a race of giants. These giants, known as the Nephilim, were not only large in stature but also powerful and influential. They ruled the pre-flood world and created chaos with violence and destruction. These giants became symbols of human corruption and rebellion by distorting the spiritual and the physical in a twisted way. Have you ever thought about how the power of giants like the Nephilim could have impacted humanity? They were not just mythical beings, but part of biblical history, shaping future events. The mention of the Nephilim in Genesis 6 is brief, but their impact is profound. These giants were one of the primary reasons why God decided to cleanse the earth through the flood. The level of corruption and sin had reached its peak, and the Nephilim played a central role in this scenario. They illustrated how the world had morally and spiritually decayed. It is not hard to imagine the fear and confusion that people must have felt as they witnessed these powerful beings destroying everything around them. But why did these fallen angels choose to unite with human women? An intriguing theory suggests that they sought to corrupt the human bloodline deeply, perhaps to prevent the coming of the promised Messiah. For if humanity had been completely corrupted, the promise of redemption would have been threatened. It is fascinating to consider how every detail of these stories holds deeper spiritual significance, far beyond what we might recognize at first glance. Even today, many people wonder what role the Nephilim actually played in biblical history. They are mentioned not only in Genesis but also in other ancient texts, such as the Book of Enoch, which describes their origin and nature in more detail. These apocryphal texts help shed more light on these mysterious giants and the spiritual legacy they left on earth. You may have also heard of other giants in mythology from around the world, and this is no coincidence. The concept of giants appears in many cultures, making the myth surrounding them even more fascinating. This brings us to the point where the Nephilim did not just leave their mark in the past, but they are still being studied by archaeologists and theologians today. Will we one day find physical evidence of the existence of these giants? Or does the true greatness of the Nephilim go beyond their physical stature, representing something much larger in the spiritual realm? This leads us to the next part of the story, where we will discover the influence of the Nephilim on the pre-flood world, the role of the Nephilim in the pre-flood world. The world before the flood was steeped in corruption and violence, and the Nephilim played a central role in this chaotic scenario. These giants were not only creatures of great physical stature, but also figures of power and dominance over mankind. They spread destruction and disorder wherever they went, corrupting humanity in ways that were both morally and spiritually far-reaching. Imagine living in a world where gigantic beings controlled lands and peoples with seemingly unstoppable force. That would certainly create a constant sense of fear. The Nephilim were described as heroes of great renown, but their fame was not based on good deeds. They were known for their violence and tyranny, accelerating the moral decay of society. In Genesis 6, it is mentioned that the whole earth was filled with violence, and this was largely due to the Nephilim and their influence. They embodied the height of rebellion against God's order, distorting the sacred and promoting chaos. This scenario can be compared to modern times, where corruption often leads to the destruction of entire societies, showing how timeless these biblical stories are. But something even deeper was happening beyond physical violence. The presence of the Nephilim symbolized an attempt to distort divine creation on a spiritual level. The union between fallen angels and human women was an act of rebellion against God's plan for humanity. If we look closely, we can see that the corruption they brought was not only external, but also internal, affecting the hearts and minds of the people. This type of spiritual influence is still evident today, where corrupt powers try to twist the truth and the values set by God. This chaotic and corrupt environment led God to make a drastic decision: the flood. The Nephilim, with their uncontrollable power and negative influence, were a key part of this judgment. God could not allow humanity to continue down this path of destruction irrevocably. It is interesting to see how the flood was both an act of judgment and mercy, a way to restart God's plan for humanity. Even today, we experience moments when we need a cleansing in our lives, whether spiritually or emotionally, to restore order and peace. Some scholars believe that the power of the Nephilim came not only from their physical strength, but also from a kind of twisted wisdom, a forbidden knowledge that the fallen angels possessed. This made them even more dangerous, as they fought not only on a physical level, but also on a spiritual and mental one. They knew how to manipulate, deceive, and control, which made them such a great threat. When we look at the world today, we see how knowledge can be used both for good and evil, depending on who possesses it and how it is applied. Now that we have a clearer picture of the pre-flood scenario, we come to the next exciting question. Did the Nephilim really disappear after the flood, or did their giant lineage somehow continue? After all, the Bible mentions giants long after the flood. Let's explore this question in the next section. The Nephilim. After the flood, did they survive? After the flood, one might assume that the Nephilim were completely wiped out, right? But the Bible surprises us by mentioning giants again after this catastrophic event. This raises a fascinating question. Did the Nephilim survive in some way, or was their lineage re-established? In Numbers 13:33, the scouts sent to Canaan reported seeing descendants of giants, the Anakim, suggesting that something eerie continued to exist on Earth. The post-Diluvian giants, such as the Rephaim and the Anakim, are mentioned in several biblical passages, and many scholars believe that they may have been descendants of the original Nephilim. This brings us to an intriguing reflection. If the flood was sent to eliminate corruption, how is it possible that giants continued to exist afterward? There are various theories about how these giants reappeared. One theory suggests that some fallen angels or their influences remained active and once again corrupted humanity. This shows that the spiritual battle described in the Bible is ongoing, and evil, though suppressed, always tries to rise again. Interestingly, the presence of these giants in Canaan was one of the greatest obstacles for the Israelites as they attempted to enter the Promised Land. They reported feeling like grasshoppers compared to the giants they faced, which highlights how intimidating these beings were, both physically and in terms of their power and influence. This makes one think about how, in our own lives, we often face immense challenges that seem insurmountable at first glance. But just as God promised the Israelites victory, we can trust that He will give us the strength to overcome our own giants. In addition to the physical and historical dimensions, the reappearance of the Nephilim or their descendants after the flood holds deep spiritual symbolism. Just as the earth was once cleansed but corruption returned, this reminds us that the battle against sin and temptation is ongoing. It's not enough to cleanse our lives once. We need constant renewal, a spiritual vigilance that protects us from negative influences. This idea of a continuous struggle reflects the spiritual journey we all face, where resisting evil is a daily task. Moreover, the existence of giants after the flood raises fascinating questions for scholars and archaeologists. Some discoveries point to the presence of giant skeletons that could be linked to these ancient biblical narratives. Could these archaeological finds actually prove the existence of the Nephilim or their descendants? This opens the door to new research, where the Bible and science may come together in unexpected ways. The field of giant archaeology is only just beginning to be explored, and who knows what discoveries lie ahead. Now that we have a clear understanding of how the Nephilim may have continued to influence the world after the flood, the next step is to examine the giants of Canaan and their relationship to the people of Israel. How did these giant tribes impact the path of the Israelites and God's plan for the Promised Land? Let's explore this in the next section. The giants of Canaan encountering the Nephilim after the flood. After the Israelites arrived in the Promised Land, they faced a challenge that few expected. In the cities of Canaan, there were still tribes of giants wandering around. In Numbers 13:33, the scouts sent by Moses reported that they had seen giants, and not just any giants, but descendants of the Nephilim. These giants were known as the Anakim, a name that quickly became synonymous with fear and resistance. Imagine the tension among the Israelites when they realized that they were not just facing human armies, but beings of mythical proportions, whose size and strength were beyond imagination. The presence of these giants in Canaan posed an emotional and spiritual obstacle for the people of Israel. Even with God's promise to give them the land, the fear was palpable. The Israelites saw themselves as grasshoppers compared to these colossal beings, showing how much the physical size of an enemy can influence our perspective. But this story powerfully reminds us that regardless of the size or strength of the challenges we face in life, faith in God can overcome any obstacle. Have you ever felt small in the face of a big problem? That's exactly how the Israelites felt. But the divine promise was greater than any giant. Interestingly, these giants were one of the main reasons why many Israelites hesitated to move forward. They represented not only physical, but also spiritual opposition. These giants of Canaan symbolized the forces that stood against God's plans. Throughout the Bible, we see that the battles against these giants were not just territorial, but also spiritual struggles to fulfill God's will. Similarly, in the modern world, we encounter giants in various forms, obstacles that seem insurmountable but can be brought down with faith. The Anakim, along with other giant tribes like the Rephaim, were only the beginning of what the Israelites found on their journey to the Promised Land. These giants were scattered across the region of Canaan, and their fortified cities and massive statures testified to the enormous challenge that lay ahead for the Israelites. But God had promised them that they would inherit this land, regardless of the giants who inhabited it. These events from the Bible remind us that even the mightiest enemies can be defeated when we act in faith, trusting in God's guidance. Today, we too often face seemingly overwhelming challenges, but it is our faith that enables us to break through these obstacles. Now that we understand the Israelites' encounters with the giants of Canaan better, let's take a closer look at the true height of the Nephilim. Was their height really as enormous as the scriptures suggest? What do ancient texts and modern discoveries tell us about the actual size of these giants? The true height of the Nephilim. Ancient texts and modern discoveries. The true height of the Nephilim remains one of the most fascinating mysteries of the Bible. Many ancient texts, including the Bible, suggest that these giants reached incredible heights, far beyond what we can imagine today. In Deuteronomy 3:11, we read about King Og of the Rephaim, whose bed was said to be about 4.5 meters long, a clear indication of his massive stature. But was this just an exaggeration to emphasize the power of these giants, or are there tangible clues that point to their actual size? Over the years, archaeologists and historians have examined various bone discoveries and ancient reports that could support the existence of giants. Some of these findings, particularly in regions like the Middle East, suggest that there were indeed people of extraordinary size. But the question remains, were these people really descendants of the Nephilim, or were they simply unusually large individuals? The answer is not clear, but the fascination that these findings evoke remains. Who knows what other discoveries are yet to be made? It's also interesting how other cultures have passed down similar stories of giants. From Norse myths about the Jotnar to the Greek tales of the Titans, almost every ancient culture has accounts of gigantic beings. These similarities suggest that the concept of giants is deeply rooted in human history and imagination. Perhaps the Nephilim were not only significant in the Judeo-Christian tradition but also symbolized superhuman power and threat in other cultures. In addition to the biblical accounts of the size of the Nephilim, modern research raises intriguing questions. Some scientists have explored the possibility that genetic anomalies or diseases like gigantism may have played a role. These explanations offer a scientific perspective on a biblical mystery, but they do not explain the whole picture. After all, the Nephilim were known not only for their size, but also for their power, brutality, and influence over humanity. This makes them far more complex figures than just physically impressive beings. There is also the question of whether the Nephilim possessed superhuman abilities that went beyond their physical stature. Some ancient texts suggest that they had a kind of supernatural knowledge or abilities that set them apart from normal humans. These abilities may explain why they had such a great influence over people before and after the flood. Perhaps the true greatness of the Nephilim lies not only in their physical size, but also in their spiritual and intellectual power, which made them a threat to divine order. Now that we have explored the true height of the Nephilim from various perspectives, the question arises regarding their deeper spiritual significance. What do the Nephilim represent in a spiritual sense, and what lessons can we draw from their story for our lives today? Let's delve into this in the next section, the spiritual significance of the Nephilim. The Nephilim are not only known for their impressive size and physical power, but also for their deeper spiritual meaning. In the Bible, they symbolize the embodiment of rebellion against God's order of creation. Their existence was the result of the union between fallen angels and humans, which is seen as a direct act of disobedience against God's plan. This mixture of the heavenly with the earthly, the pure with the corrupted, served as a symbol of the increasing depravity of mankind. It shows us that spiritual corruption often has profound effects on the physical world. The presence of the Nephilim brought not only physical violence and destruction to the pre-flood world, but also led to deep moral and spiritual confusion. The people of that time, oppressed by the Nephilim, lived in a state of constant fear and disorientation. This reminds us of how destructive it is when spiritual leadership is absent or distorted. The story of the Nephilim warns us that the pursuit of power and dominance without spiritual integrity will always lead to chaos and destruction. We see similar examples in the modern world, where corruption often destroys the moral compass of a society. It is also interesting how the Nephilim can be interpreted as a symbol of the spiritual battle between good and evil. The Bible describes them as enemies of God who sought to thwart His plans by corrupting human nature. This spiritual struggle is something we still encounter today. There may no longer be physical giants, but the challenges we face in our faith and morality are no less intimidating. The Nephilim teach us that we must remain vigilant to keep our spiritual lives pure and not succumb to the influences of evil. The destruction of the Nephilim through the flood shows that God's justice and mercy always go hand in hand. God put an end to the evil embodied by the Nephilim, but He did so to give humanity a new chance to walk on a cleansed path. This is an important spiritual lesson. There is always an opportunity for renewal, no matter how deep the corruption. However, we must be willing to allow the destruction of the old to make room for the new. This lesson is also relevant today when we seek spiritual renewal in our own lives. Finally, the Nephilim remind us that the spiritual battle never ends. Their return after the flood, in the form of the Anakim and other giants, shows that evil always tries to creep back into human life. This ongoing battle is something we face daily. It requires not only faith but also constant vigilance to protect ourselves from influences that want to pull us away from God's plan. In our spiritual lives, this means that we must continually renew ourselves and ensure that our choices and actions align with God's will. Now that we understand the spiritual significance of the Nephilim, it is time to ask the next question. How can we apply this knowledge to our daily lives in fighting the modern giants that threaten us? The knowledge of the Nephilim, their true size, and their role in history can significantly change our understanding of the biblical narratives and their meaning for humanity. These giants were not only physically impressive, but also carried deep spiritual meaning. They represent the eternal battle between good and evil, the attempt of evil to thwart God's plan, and God's response to save and renew humanity. The discoveries and research surrounding the Nephilim offer us not only a glimpse into the past, but also lessons for our world today. The spiritual battle symbolized by these giants continues to this day. It is up to us to remain vigilant, strengthen our faith, and resist the forces that try to lead us away from our divine path. It is a reminder that evil can return in different forms, but faith and divine guidance will always prevail. The true height of the Nephilim may remain a mystery, but the impact they had on humanity and history is undeniable. They teach us that the spiritual battle never ends, and that we must always trust God to defeat our personal giants. And just as the Israelites stood before the Anakim, we too must be prepared to face our greatest fears, trusting that God will give us the victory. Now that you've gathered all this fascinating knowledge about the Nephilim, it's up to you to apply it. How will you approach the spiritual battle in your own life? What giants do you need to conquer? Think about it, and before you move on, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends. And of course, subscribe to the channel to keep learning more about these exciting biblical mysteries.